watching the module concerning the future of Brazil, or Brazil, the land of the future. In this module, we will talk about some conceptions of the future that Brazil has. Brazil is a nation with a long history about thinking about their place in the future and how they might reflect some form of possible humanity that exists in the future. This idea is often seen very inspirationally and allows politicians and cultural thinkers to imagine a Brazil that is post-racial, that doesn't suffer from racism or poverty, one that is able to overcome some of the more divisive things we can see in other parts of the world. On the other side of the coin, we see a lot of people invoking this phrase to speak rather ironically about Brazil's possibilities for the future. There are many examples where the hope for a future have been dashed rather violently and spectacularly, and it's caused traumas in Brazil, especially among those individuals and those classes that have longed to be more included in Brazil. And I'll point to the screen right now just to show some images, describe what they are. There is a screen cap from the film Brazil, a História de Folia, mais ou menos, which is more or less a movie that takes place in 3 different generations. It's an animated film. It's sort of like anime, and it looks at 3 different times: colonial Brazil, modern day Brazil, and the future of Brazil. And so we see sort of this idea that the Cristo is sort of dystopic and there are high rises towering over the mountains. So very futuristic. We also have some modern ideas of time travel and some other cultural representations. And then we also have some symbols of the past ideas for the future that are sort of going up in flames. In 2018, the Brazilian National Museum burned down. It was a huge loss for humanity. Millions of specimens were lost, and it was established at one time in the 1890s as a monument to the possibilities of Brazil, to the diversity and the spectacular aspects of Brazil. And when it burned down on the international stage a little bit before Notre Dame Cathedral burned down. So there's several sort of issues with failing to maintain the previous monuments to the future. So we can see here that the future is always sort of incomplete, that the future is often developing in a way that is unfulfilled. One person that I always like to refer to when talking about Brazil and the future is Stefan Zweig. He was a gringo, he was an Austrian, one of the best-selling authors in the world during the 1920s and 30s. A few years ago, Wes Anderson, the American director that is known for The Royal Tenenbaums and The Life Aquatic and some other more recent films, Fantastic Mr. Fox is an animated film that he did a few years back. He made a movie, The Hotel Budapest, about more or less a story that Stefan Zweig wrote. So just to put this in the context, 1920s, 1930s, sort of this cosmopolitan age. 1940s happened. Stefan Zweig, being an Austrian Jew, was forced into exile. He first spent some time in England, then the United States, and then finally arrived in Brazil. And being one of the best-selling authors in the world, he was very well received. The first book he wrote was called Brazil, O País do Futuro, translated into English as Brazil, the Land of the Future. And in this book, he really engaged some of the positive possibilities for Brazil, this post-racial land. He was fleeing a genocide, Nazi Germany, and he was finding this place where it didn't matter that he was a Jew. There was not this violent segregation that he saw in the United States. It was a place where there seemed to be an attempt at broader racial harmony. He wrote a book about this. It was picked up by the dictatorship at the time and subsequent dictatorships as an example of why Brazil tends to be exceptional. Brazil tends to be this very unique place in the history of the world. This was very much a book that reflected Stefan Zweig's optimism for his own life, his ability to possibly restart. He was already beyond middle age when he had to be forced into exile without the possibility of ever returning to Nazi Germany. Nazis were still very much in power, and he was welcomed with open arms by a country that did not need to welcome him. Fast forward a year later, Stefan Zweig is tormented by all the ghosts of Europe that he left behind. All his early books were written in these very happy, optimistic times, and he's realizing now how blind he was for much of his life. And on top of this, he's realizing that many of his friends have disappeared, they've died, or they've also been ruined by the war. So these ghosts of Europe are haunting him. He writes his final memoir, an autobiography, about his times when he was in his 20s and his 30s, living life in Austria when Austria was possibly the most intellectually sophisticated country in the world. He was the best-selling author in the world, and this life was very naive. So he's talking about how he was blind to the comings of hatred and how youth often blinds people to the future. And he finishes this book. He takes it to a mailbox, puts it in the mailbox, and sends it off to his editor along with his suicide note. And he goes back home, and him and his wife kill themselves. And very, very dramatic story, and it is very symbolic of some of the more complex relationships that people have with Brazil, especially immigrants and people that have high hopes for its future, people that seem to get sucked into its optimism. And it's not necessarily the fact that Brazil failed Stefan Zweig, but the fact that he put so much hope and so much positivity into a place that ended up not being able to follow through. I think that's a very powerful lesson to talk about a lot of Brazil's broader intentions for the future, possibilities for the future, some of the dramatic failures that we see over and over again. In the last 10 years, we can see that Brazil's socialist democracy has completely failed. A lot of those social inclusion programs have been completely dismantled. And so that was one of the more recent transitions from high periods of social inclusion and hope to an almost fatalistic representation of Brazil, fatalistic interpretation of Brazil's possibilities. And Stefan Zweig, although he is a gringo and he is a foreigner and he had a very limited experience in Brazil, and he might have been a little bit manipulated in order to be used as a propaganda machine, this sentiment was still very much in force throughout much of the dictatorship, and there's a large number of Brazilians that really get swept up in this discourse of a very utopic and racially and socially inclusive Brazil. And so we can see it's a fantasy. It really is a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that people believe in and people practice and people rally behind. So when I talk about Brazil as the country of the future, I embrace Stefan Zweig's dual interpretations of this future. Not only this optimism, but also the result, and often the fatalistic result that occurs when that optimism fades, and it often turns into something far more tragic. So we can see many examples from modern day Brazil, and these are things that I engage with in my research, and I engage with individuals in more applied work and try to help individuals in these particular sectors in Brazil. But we have the favela, the shantytown of Vidigal here, and this is one of the more privileged shantytowns in Rio de Janeiro, in the world, most likely. It hangs high over Leblon and Ipanema, the two wealthiest neighborhoods in Rio de Janeiro. But it's still a favela. It's still an informal shantytown community that has been socially and racially excluded. So we see a number of contradictions. This is a very visible and visual representation of contradiction taking place here. But we also can see things appearing in other cultural products, other political products that are equally contradictory when we talk about Brazil. I also like to talk about the concept of anthropophagy or cannibalism. And this is a really interesting frame of reference to talk about modern Brazil. You can really put this on top of any political, social, economic practice in Brazil, and you can make it work to some extent. And you can speak with Brazilians, and they'll have a conversation with you about this. And they might not always be incredibly invested in this, but for those who are, will be able to understand this very visceral, this very carnal nature of Brazilians' inequality, of its contradictions, of its hopes for the future. It often gets played out in very dramatic forms, very traumatic forms as well. And this is not only mentally traumatic, but it's also often physically traumatic. People die. We see that in the last 10 years alongside the hope for dramatic social inclusion in the favelas, so the building of hospitals and the building of schools, we see that there were intense militarizations of these communities. So a pacification policy, for example, that was implemented across Rio de Janeiro resulted in the death of hundreds of individuals and the displacement of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals. So we see that there was a form of self-consumption going on. Brazil, in order for it to grow, had to perform a sense of violence on itself, a sense of hygiene, a sense of urban sanitation that was very destructive and traumatic for a great deal of individuals. So this hope for a safer Brazil and a more inclusive Brazil often contradicted with one another in the favelas, and it often resulted in optimism turning into abstract form of pessimism. So we think of the more visceral, the more corporeal, the more bodily forms of these contradictions getting played out, and I think we can see a really good example of anthropophagy. There's also a lot of uncertainty in Brazil, and this goes along with this swing from optimism to pessimism. And this is just a fact. In Brazil, it seems like there's very dramatic swings. It feels like it is an economy and a political body that is very much influenced by more powerful global players like the United States, and now more recently China has come in and tried to exert its influence. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, trading partner of Brazil, and it's growing every year. It's going to take it over as the top global partner with Brazil in almost every single category. We see that there was other times where it was the country of Brazil was establishing better connections with Europe and the European Union. And of course, there's various points in the United States history of influencing the political dynamics within the country of Brazil, even in the last 10 years. The economic swings in Brazil, and this is on the screen, I have some just graphs of the most recent economic upturns and downturns. So the one on the left is the market expectations. So this was the broader survey of individuals, what they expected growth in the market, and it is going down consistently from the beginning of 2019 to the middle of 2019. And this was a dramatic lowering of expectation for the gross national product over this time. So the economy was really shifting, and sometimes the economy booms. The economy was booming for 15 years, but now it seems like it's in this area of uncertainty and stagnation. It's very much defining a lot of the everyday discourse in Brazil right now. And then if we look at the right-hand side, we see economic certainty. So this is what people feel in terms of certainty towards the market. And we can see large spikes of up and down over the years taking place. There's social uncertainty as well. We can relate it to the favela, but we can also see that Brazil is a country of very diverse social and political backgrounds. There is often efforts to stigmatize the poor right alongside efforts to include the poor. And you can use any marginalized group to see those same types of uncertainties. And then there's a great deal of political uncertainty, specifically since 2015, when the process of impeachment against Dilma Rousseff started, and coming into even a period of elected presidential politics in the form of Jair Bolsonaro. There is constant conversation about impeachment, constant conversation about the role of government in Brazil's daily life. So there's uncertainty, there's lack of definitions, there is confusion often. There are some ways that Brazil sees itself and sees its future, and these can sometimes be comical, they can sometimes be overly dramatic. Brazil is a large country, it has a gigantic economy, and it has a great deal of influence over its neighbors in Latin America. Sometimes the country is compared to Venezuela in the form of the shift towards more communist or socialist leaning policies. This is often said in a way to deride the leftward shift in politics in Brazil. Venezuela is seen as a corrupt country, one where the government was very active in dismantling wealth and economic viability. And this is just a broader discourse that gets spoken about in Brazil a lot. Everyday Brazilians see Venezuela in a relatively pejorative light. And then you have the example of Colombia, which is also a neighbor of Brazil. And they've seen that country pull itself out of a generational drug war, very similar to what's taking place in Brazil since the 1990s. Pablo Escobar and all of the Cali cartels were more or less in charge of Colombia at the time in the 1970s and 80s and into the 90s, with intense reconfiguration of the internal politics of the Colombian government, as well as intense influence from the United States. We see that they were able to fight drug trafficking to a great degree, bring stability to the country, and even solve some of the more deep social divides that exist in the country beyond the drug trade, specifically thinking about FARC, the rebel group that existed in Colombia and now has signed a peace treaty with the government, and they're sort of declared their guerrilla war over. And they're being inclusive in many different ways. There's problems in Colombia, of course. There would be the critique of it going too far to the right, too far to a globalized standard. So the idea that Colombia should be a secondary player to the United States or any other partner could be problematic for Brazilians who like to see Brazil as the primary benefactor of Brazilian policy, Brazilian economic goods, and Brazilian efforts, cultural products. So we can apply this idea of the future in many different ways. One of the more recent interpretations of the future was the 2019 film Divino Amor, or Divine Love. It is a dystopian future where more or less in 10 years after it was made, so 10 years after 2019, we see that there is a evangelical government and social paradigm that has taken over the whole of Brazil. One of the opening scenes that I really found very compelling in this movie was more or less a burkini at a beach in Brazil. If you go to a beach in Brazil, it's the smallest bikini ever. There's a lot of people wearing, men wearing Speedos, as we would call them in the United States, just the one piece, not baggy, tight fitting, very much exposing someone's body as much as possible without going past a level of decency, without revealing sensitive areas, personal areas. Okay, so we see that happen in real life, but in the movie, they present the beach as almost like The Handmaid's Tale, if we make an American reference to an American cultural product, where women are expected to practice modesty and expected to cover parts of their body. That was one of the key ideas that I really liked in the movie. We also see some other aspects that are actually very common practices in Brazil nowadays, but we see that they are more all-encompassing. There is what appears to be a Bible study, and it turns out to be sort of like a swingers church, a church of swinging, where couples come together to try to revitalize their marriage. Divorce is highly stigmatized, and there's a huge bureaucratic process. It's allowed, but it's very highly stigmatized. And the goal of a good Brazilian citizen is to try to save their marriage. And so we see this sort of Bible study transform into more or less a swingers nightclub. And then they go to like a Daft Punk on 1990s steroids rave afterwards that is supposedly replacing Carnival. And if you look at the internal politics of Brazil, we see that the evangelical groups in Brazil are very much against Carnival for many different reasons. They see it as debaucherous, they see it as overly sexualized, they see that it welcomes vice in the terms of consuming alcohol onto the streets. And recent politicians, specifically Crivella, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro that was elected in 2016, he has implemented various steps to empower churches during Carnival and defund many of the public funds that were traditionally available towards Carnival and Carnival parades and Carnival parties. And so we see this as a reflection. Divine Love is reflecting a religious turn in Brazil using a evangelical narrative. And this is interesting too. You know, there's some very Catholic histories in Brazil, and the evangelical presence in Brazil is often shocking for people who aren't religious, and for people who are religious and who have adapted evangelicalism. It's seen as a very progressive religion compared to maybe the more traditional Catholic religion with its more rigid institutions, and which also has a more problematic history, politicized history in Brazil. It tends to be more exclusive and more elite nowadays. Some other aspects that I find very interesting about Divine Love: there is an almost suburban American aesthetic, and this is also something that is often highly critiqued in Brazil. We see the idea that the future of Brazil often looks like what an idealized image of America looks like. We see this take place time and again in Brazil. The rise of Brazilian democracy was often done under the auspices of trying to achieve what the United States has achieved over time in terms of representational democracy and developing capitalist economies. We also see in the 1950s the modernization push in Brazil, principally headed by JK, one of the last elected presidents before the dictatorship. He was the one who ushered in and inaugurated Brasilia, which was more or less a driver's capital. It was made for people to drive cars around. Very much different than the old colonial capital of Rio de Janeiro, where most people walk or take the bus. Cars are, of course, very popular, but it's not a car-friendly city. Brasilia is freeways, big boulevards, and parking lots. And so we see that there was a specific homage to American 1950s consumerism taking place when they were developing Brasilia. More recently, in Brazil's turn economically, we can see that there was a great effort of the socialist-leaning governments to encourage, ironically, very coincidentally, a consumer market among the poor. That was seen as a form of inclusion. If we could expand the ability of poor people to buy international products, much like we see in the United States, where the people who are most impoverished can often still afford a car, can often still afford a phone. If we can develop those type of rights for the poor, we will be doing great levels of institutional and economic inclusion. We also see that with the election of Jair Bolsonaro, often considered the Brazilian Trump, there was a big political movement that tried to mirror what Trump was able to achieve in 2016 during the Brazilian 2018 election. So there's a lot of parallels with looking towards the United States as a symbol of success, as a symbol of the future. And Divine Love does a really good job about subtly hinting towards that aesthetic. There is a drive-through chapel, something that has sprouted up in Brazil over the last few years. This is a very interesting dynamic. We see a lot of the heavy lifting in this film takes place in this chapel where the main character, a woman who is having trouble conceiving a child in this very strict land of evangelical social norms, where she's having trouble conceiving a child, she is eventually confronted with all these doubts about her place in the world. And then also, towards the end of the film, we see that there is a very peculiar impregnation that takes place, one that doesn't necessarily fit into the history of this woman. We see that there's also some doubts about faith taking place, some things that maybe the average person would have, but also how individuals use faith as a crutch to negotiate some of their hard aspects of their life, some of the hardships that they have. So we see this all playing out in this drive-through confessional booth that is run by this sort of benevolent preacher that has her sing music, his prayer, and all these sort of catchy, really nice, brightly covered and very much enthusiastically accepted cultural practices. And so as we look at this, this sort of evolves the film. It's a very visceral film. We see blue and red throughout the film, boys and girls, a lot about children. It's almost like even on the cover, so this image right here is of the cover of the film. It almost looks like a Twitter symbol, right? It's very much, it's a dove flying. It's a religious symbol, but it also very much looks like it's this very modern thing. And one thing we can see here in Brazil, this is not a critique necessarily of what possibly evangelicalism could do. It's not a critique of evangelicalism. It's more or less a idea of what Brazil's future could be if it continues going on its current social path. I don't think the director and the screenwriters are idealizing this at all, trying to make this seem like a positive thing, trying to make this seem like a thing that should happen, but rather they're just interpreting, they're imagining a Brazil, an idealism for the future. And we see underneath the bright shininess of this future some very complicated things, specifically relating to faith, but also a society that still has some issues with inclusion, some issues with faith, some issues with understanding and accepting people. We also see, too, just linking it back to a broader theme from the course, an idea of anthropophagy. We see this as a very visceral thing, people consuming the flesh in Brazil. When you see or hear talk about people having sex, the word to eat, comer, is often used. And this is something that could be related to some of those contradictions, some of those elements of anthropophagy that I discussed earlier on. So one phrase that I alluded to at the beginning of this lecture, but I think is good to end on, is the idea that Brazil sempre vai ser o país do futuro. Brazil will always be the country of the future. This is a phrase that has been said alongside that initial phrase of Brazil, the country of the future. We see the word always there, sempre vai ser. The idea that it always will be the country of the future. So it will always be a place where people can imagine the future of the world, the future of the globe, the future potentials for humanity. But it always will be a place that will be limited by things. And this is not to say any other country in the world does not have its struggles or its limits, but this contradiction is very important and feels very much part of the Brazilian cultural and political experience. I just look here on the image. This was happening in 2018, 2019. There's been a series of ecological disasters in Brazil. And this is something that went along with developing the interior of Brazil, was a huge series of ecological disasters. And so we're going to see that the benefits of exploiting nature, specifically this was an oil spill. They still did not find out where it came from. It covered the oceans. People were going in. This boy was trying to help clean the oceans covered in oil. Very devastating for coastal life, which is already highly devastated over 500 years of colonization and mass exploitation for many different reasons, fishing and agriculture. We see that this is just one other one other hit against Brazil's armor, one other hit against that idea that the future will be a good thing in Brazil. So, as we take this phrase going forward, as you think about the world and other places in the world that often are overly optimistic, we should always be conscious of these contradictions.